Great. Greetings, colleagues, at the now virtual 8th International Conference of Community Psychology. My name is Bianca Wilson. I'm here to talk about a project that we did on LGBT poverty. Quickly, this is just a list of many of our folks from our Community Advisory Board, my co-investigators and project managers and coordinators that all worked on this paper. So, just to give you a sense of what brought us to the current project that I'm talking about today, it's been well known, just like there are many other kind of dimensions of social statuses where we know that some people experience higher rates of poverty, that sexual orientation and gender identity status are also among those dimensions of disparities. So that is, LGBT people in the US do experience or have been found to experience higher rates of poverty compared to cis straight people. So several large scale surveys in the US have continued to demonstrate that over the last several decades. That includes among LGBT individual people as well as same-sex couples. What we have less research on is what seems to account for that sexual orientation and gender minority status finding. What's going on, the how and why of how poverty is so prevalent among LGBT people. There are, of course, a number of hypotheses about that, including the role of LGBT-related discrimination, and that claim is often used in current services and advocacy work, but there's very little empirical work just on the lives of LGBT people who are low income and how they understand their experiences and where LGBT status plays a unique role. So to that end, we designed the Pathways to Justice project. This is a project that was several years long, actually involved a full quantitative side and the qualitative side, which is what I'll be talking to you about today. This was a 2-county study in one of the states within the US, California. The 2 counties were Los Angeles and Kern County. Los Angeles representing a very urban space, and Kern representing a less urban and rural in many areas of the county, so representing a rural kind of geography. Now, at the time that this conference was intended to happen, we were nowhere close finishing this report, but now have actually completed the report. So I'll be talking about a very small component of this overall findings report, but you can find the full report and on our website. So while there were many aims to the project, I'm really focusing on this part. Essentially, we wanted to understand what are some of the pathways into poverty. Essentially, where does economic instability seem to begin for LGBT people? A little bit about the design of this part of the Pathways Project Initiative. This is a qualitative study. It is mixed methods in that it's a concurrent nested design, but qualitative approach was really the dominant approach. The questions designed around a qualitative methodology. We did in-depth semi-structured interviews, but used pre-interview questionnaires and screeners and follow-up questionnaires to help address related questions to the ones centered in the in-depth interview. Most of the interviews were conducted pre-COVID, just to provide some context, because I think if it was post, the discussion related to economic stability does look different and is more exacerbated. Both look similar and exacerbated from the few that were conducted after the pandemic began. It was such an ever-present issue. So I just want to note that most of what you hear is what happened before the pandemic. And we use a quota-based convenience sampling approach in order to maximize diversity, particularly people of color, transgender folks, older people, and to make sure we obtained at least a third of the sample coming from the rural county. In terms of the analysis, given the time, I'm not going to go into too much detail here, But just to give you a sense, this was not completely dependent upon emergent themes. We did have a code book that we looked for people's experiences in key domains of this phenomenon around housing, food insecurity, employment, experiences with services. But we did make room for both emergent issues to be noted in the data, as well as the process of trying to understand how the different codes fit together into themes was an iterative process. So in terms of who was in the study, well, by design, to be eligible, people had to be low income or indicate some level of economic insecurity. And so, not surprisingly, most of the sample had very low income, less than $20,000 a year. And that's with one or more people living in the household. Many or most experience unstable housing relatively recently. We did have a large age range, mostly people of color, and we conducted nearly 100 interviews across the counties. So as I noted, we had a number of aims for the study, and the report is finished. So what I'm going to do is just quickly mention some of the other overall findings that are covered in this particular report, but then I'll only be going into detail on the one that I mentioned, which is pathways into poverty. So again, some of the themes that were identified are just detailing and demonstrating through quotes what essentially did poverty look like for LGBT folks. And not surprisingly, it looks a lot like what you expect to see among the general population, experiencing housing insecurity, food insecurity, transportation issues. Having high debt was a major issue that came up quite a bit. You'll see a quote here from Ralph, a 42-year-old American Indian identified cis gay man. Here, he actually talks about this relationship between a very common experience of poverty among, all SOGI groups, including straight cis people, the process of trying to find housing and shelters and looking for a dorm to live in, kind of the single residency type of facilities. But here you also see an LGBT specific component to it, where he says, a lot of them, I'm trying to find one, but a lot of them are Christian, and, they're not too supporting, or they're not really into homosexuality. So you do get a sense of both the things that feel general population type of experiences, but also LGBT specific. Other findings that we identified had to do with both factors related to the experience of poverty, substance use, anti-LGBT discrimination, that all of the SOGI groups, meaning cis lesbian, cis gay men, trans women, trans men, gender non-binary. We looked at what types of factors were across all these groups, as well as which ones seemed to be uniquely experienced by each group. Those, again, are in the report, but I'm going to focus on this last one, which was the pathways into poverty, and in particular, the significant role that childhood poverty seemed to play in that. So when we talk about childhood poverty, this is one of the findings that was both not emergent, in that we asked every participant, tell us about growing up. Where'd you grow up? What was your family like? What ethnicities were relevant to you, growing up, or what cultures were relevant to you growing up? And we also asked about, do you remember a time where money seemed to be an issue when you were younger? So we went into the study knowing that it was important to have that background. We did not anticipate necessarily how significant of an issue it was for most of the LGBT people. So here's one quote from Dee, over 50-year-old lesbian trans woman from LA. And she talks about, remembering her parents needing to shoplift, and like for their food, for hygiene, but they were also struggling with substance abuse issues. And so she remembers them needing money, both for their drugs, but also for rent. And, she says we were always without stuff. We were never like as a child, she said, no, I'd wake up, there'd be new stereo, new TV, new picture on the wall, and the next day it would all be gone. So she also talks about some of the chaotic aspect of what it meant to grow up with parents who were dealing with addiction issues, that they'd have these new things and then they were gone because they were selling their stuff for the money that they needed. So we were always unstable and we never had money for nothing. So again, the experience of childhood poverty was detailed by a number of participants, more than we expected though. So when we think of some of these major indicators, like the ones that Dee talked about, where parents had to steal in order to get the things that they needed for themselves and to feed their children, also sometimes managing addiction issues, or experiencing homelessness or children in and out of foster care, that they remember their parents receiving benefits like, the food stamps, or that they got reduced fee lunches at school. So indicators that were, that their parents were low income. Over half of the sample talked about this. And when you take that together with another 20% who talked about, more minor indicators, like they just remember their parents saying that they were having money issues, even if they didn't necessarily feel the effects of that day to day, over 2/3, 73%, talked about either these types of major or these minor indicators of childhood poverty. So that seemed very significant. And then when we looked at, well, who in the study is talking about childhood poverty? The kind of dimension of race and ethnicity really stood out, that when we looked at who we were coding as discussing childhood poverty and who wasn't, predominantly the participants of color, particularly American Indian, Latinx, and Black folks in the study, were talking about experiencing very, kind of heavy, like major indicators of childhood poverty when they were growing up, and not so much among white and Asian Pacific Islander folks. More of these groups experience more minor indicators, but still not as much as the other groups of people of color. And so, this stands out, both that it's significant for thinking about what this means for LGBT poverty in general, but also demonstrating that some of the kind of distribution of racial disparities that we see in poverty in the US and in many other countries, that it's paralleled within the LGBT population too. Now, for those who, we turn to look, well, for those who didn't experience childhood poverty, our analytic question was, well, then where did economic instability seem to start? And when we looked at that smaller group, which is about 25 or so of the sample, what we see are predominantly these three main issues: that there's some type of break with the family, usually around family rejection due to their LGBT status. So a number of participants in this smaller group that grew up middle or upper income, they talk about this, I'm not gonna call my mom for help after I finish college because, they're not okay with me being gender non-binary and gay. And so they talk about this. And then, or substance use and addiction issues or mental health issues seeming to be kind of a starting place for struggling with employment, maintaining employment, or also connected to breaks from their middle and upper class families. So taken together, when we looked at the data and really saw that this experience of childhood poverty seemed to stratify the entire sample, like those who did and those who didn't, in terms of understanding this starting place for economic instability in their adult lives. That for some, it started in childhood, and for others, it did not start in childhood, but began with some kind of break from the family financial resources for a number of reasons, whether it was the, anti-gay family rejection or anti-trans family rejection, substance use or mental health issues. But eventually both sides, both kind of subgroups in the sample still end up in this third tier where there are a never-ending circle, like cycling of factors that then were relevant to their experiences with poverty, including cycles of low-wage jobs, not having as much education opportunities, parenting with little resources, either because they started out in their childhood and adulthood with little resources, or they were rejected from their parents and are now parenting themselves and don't have the resources from their families of origin. So this third tier, while some groups might get to those factors sooner than others, eventually all of those factors really intertwine with one another, centering and in the center a lot of the experiences of discrimination and stigma that they talk about related to race, gender, immigration status, and LGBT status, as well as their experiences with services. So, here this is not intended as, the data do not suggest a very clear and consistent linear path between what happens in childhood and adult poverty, but it was very clear that the experience of childhood poverty really differentiated where people started out in the study and the type of experiences they seemed to have first that started them on a pathway toward adult LGBT economic insecurity. So just to end, in conclusion, at least a couple of takeaways here. One, on the research side, the findings demonstrated to us that, my colleagues and I, we've had a lot of conversations about how do we think about the tendency to invoke intersectionality as a framework when talking about LGBT poverty in particular. And that, for example, the pathways into poverty cannot be easily explained as this simultaneous experience of homophobia, racism, sexism, and all the isms that an LGBT person of color, for example, embodies, right? So they embody those statuses, can experience those multiple forms of oppression, but the pathway into poverty is not necessarily explained by that. If for many, over 70% of the sample, started economic instability prior to their LGBT status. So it really was a call for us to think about collectively the need for greater contextualized theoretical specificity about when you can apply intersectionality in its kind of most common form, meaning a simultaneous experience of all those oppressions, when you can apply it and when you can't. And that it did appear that for many of the LGBT people in this sample, if we were to say, what type forms of oppression and stigma were relevant to the onset of poverty, the LGBTQ part of it was not there for many of them. So just a need to be more thoughtful about when we talk about intersectionality and in what context and at what time points in people's lives that it's relevant in its fullest sense. And then also just practically, reminding us that, efforts to reduce poverty among LGBT people really should aim to improve the existing LGBT specific efforts that are out there by integrating a focus on communities of color, children, and families. That essentially, the study suggests that if a lot of the poverty that LGBT people are experiencing starts back when they were children and in their families that were not necessarily LGBT led, like their parents were not all LGBT, then part of an LGBT services and policy agenda should be more inclusive of efforts to decrease poverty in neighborhoods, families, communities that are low income in general, regardless of whether LGBT people are in those families yet. Because eventually the children in those families will be part of the LGBT people, adults that we're looking at later who are experiencing poverty. And then finally, because family rejection related to LGBT status and LGBT discrimination did come up with most participants at some point in their adult lives, the study does indicate that we need to improve general population services by integrating more work on that anti-LGBT discrimination front and family work around rejection. So thank you for your time today. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact us. And also, again, the fuller report is up on our website at the Williams Institute. Thank you very much.